All right, so you and I wrote a two-part article, primarily in response to the increasing popularity of the term egregores um, in the conversation around higher beings, and also as an attempt to examine some of the ambiguities and potential issues in Jonathan Pageau's language around higher beings.
Mhm.
Um, and Jonathan then subsequently had a talk with John Vervaeke and Jordan Hall about it on his channel. Uh, and then shortly thereafter, he had the two of us on his channel as well to talk about it too.
Yeah.
Um, and in that conversation, although we only really touched on it briefly, he ended up kind of framing it as primarily a discussion around AI and around the notion of the golem. Um, and I thought that was like an interesting twist. I'm guessing he did that to kind of like to separate it from his previous conversation with Jordan Hall and John Vervaeke, and to have kind of something else for his viewers to um, to latch onto with that particular video.
Yeah, I think
Um,
that's just where it flowed to
for sure,
with our interactions with him. But yeah.
for sure. And then there was at least one commentary video, also tracking the thread from Paul Vanderklay. There could have been others that we just didn't see,
Mhm.
um, and he kind of picked up on. It's interesting to kind of see like the different things that people kind of take away from these conversations,
Yeah.
and the sort of potentially different or differing like tentative conclusions that like everybody comes to
Yeah.
when the dust all settles. So today I thought we could do kind of like a follow up on the whole thread,
Great.
and maybe try to take stock of where we've landed and kind of where things go from here.
Yeah, that'd be great. So I guess yeah, I'd like to like aim for a situation where like people feel like they can stand on a little bit of solid ground with this subject, which is going to be difficult because I don't feel like I am standing on solid ground when I think about it or talk about it. But my aim in writing the article, I'm not sure about yours, but my aim in particular was to kind of open out and make flexible the conversation area, because Jonathan Pageau was beginning to talk to lots of different people about this subject, and I felt like we could be a little bit more flexible with the terms that we were using. And the conversation that Pageau had with Hall and Vervaeke was an amazing like outcome from the article. It was like exactly what I was aiming for, and like that's what I wanted to see. I didn't want to, I wasn't ever claiming that me or you or anybody had the answer to the question of higher beings, right? But the outcome, like the conversation between Hall and Vervaeke and Pageau, did provide us with something like a categorization system, which Jonathan Pageau also mentions in our conversation. So we could like basically map that out and talk about some of the issues around it and some of the interesting points around it. But I guess we could also, yeah, I think we should probably do that first. So
Well, first, before we jump into that, I just want to say,
mhm,
I think I think we achieved uh, two things from this whole thread, um, and these were kind of like so I shared your aim of achieving that flexibility, but at the
mhm,
same time it was for me it was like a two-pronged thing. Like I wanted to arrive at that kind of a flexibility, and being able to kind of look at this subject from a lot of different angles, right? Like to be able to kind of bring into the fold the scientific perspective, varying religious perspectives, philosophical perspectives, right? So like that's kind of like the way that I'm seeing it in terms of that flexibility.
yeah,
But the other aspect that I was kind of aiming for was a level of increased like clarity and precision, like
mhm,
within those different like lenses that we're sort of approaching it from, right?
Yeah.
So it's like I felt like before it was kind of maybe a little bit one-sided in terms of like the angle that the topic was being attacked from. And then within that one-sided angle, there was like some lack of clarity, right? So like our task was kind of to clean up some of the ambiguities, like within those particular perspectives and frameworks, but then also to bring the other frameworks like into the fold.
Yeah. But like 100% clarity isn't like, we would only be able to provide 100% clarity if we had a totality of understanding, right?
It's true, and we're not
To
gonna
an,
we're
to
not
an
gonna
extent.
achieve that. Yeah, we didn't,
Yeah.
and that's definitely not the aim. But like I think where there are clear issues and like contradictions in framing these things, I think like it's good to just be able to point them out.
Mm.
Yeah, again, without like you're saying, like without claiming any kind of absolute understanding, which we
Yeah.
shouldn't be striving for in the first place. So anyway,
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt
No,
your
that's cool.
train of thought there.
No, it's good. Yeah. So Pageau, like, to us in our video, summed up a kind of three-way category system for conceiving of higher beings. And the first one is uh, beings which are in a continuum within the hierarchy which proceeds to God. And Jonathan used the phrase a being that exists in higher being, a being that exists in higher love.
Hmm.
And so these beings, which should involve us, of which we should be one, like ideally, has their attention fixed upon God and diverts the attention which is given to them towards God uh, in various ways. Um, and this is a kind of extremely profound like category, which is so kind of simple and complicated at the same time that it's difficult to know what to say about it, because the more that you say about it, the less you understand, I feel like. I don't know if you want to say much about that category or way of thinking about higher beings.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with you that it's at once simple and incredibly complicated. I think that the way that I've come to talk about this category is in terms of entities whose sort of mode of being is in accordance with their logos. So it's
Mm-hmm.
it's it's and I used that terminology in our conversation with Pageau, and I think I maybe kind of blew through it a little too quickly, assuming maybe too much prior uh, terminological knowledge on the part of the viewer. But so there's this notion of the mode of being, the tropos, right, which is the way that the pattern is actually playing itself out or manifesting in the world, and then the logos, which is the eternal or divine intention for that entity, right? So
Mm-hmm.
this first category of beings would be beings which are in accordance or acting in accordance with their logoi, right? Which of course all stack up into the supreme hierarchy, funneling all the way up to the Godhead.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the way that I look at it.
Great. Yeah, that's amazing. And the second category that Jonathan mentioned was parasitic beings, and these kind of exist in pride for themselves. And the examples which we saw in their conversation with things like bureaucracy, gangs like mobsters, and they take resources or attention to themselves for their own purposes rather than directing it towards God. Um, and then I can quickly move on to the third category, because I think there's an issue in distinguishing them.
Mm.
And the third category is kind of Pageau like giving us credit or condescending to our position, which was headless beings, which don't have a real identity or consist of a confusion of identities and lead to a confusion of attention. They don't have like a principle or a head, mixtures of different categories. Yeah, confusion of purpose. So I think that so that was the three categories which Jonathan Pageau presented to us. But I think that really, even if you listen to their conversation, the conversation between Pageau, Hall, and Vervaeke, I think that the two latter categories become confused quite frequently. And I can give an example of that. So Jordan Hall gives the example of a dead rabbit, which is a change in a mode of organization or a change in being of an entity. So we have an alive rabbit, which is, ideally acting according to its logos, or is a being which is fulfilling the plan for it. But when it dies, the body, which was animated by life, gets taken over by another regime, by another logic, by a regime of death. And Hall is kind of invoking it as an example of a parasitic process. So all of the cells or the parts of the rabbit disintegrates, but also they take all of the life and the stored energy which the rabbit had and kind of use it for their own purposes, which are just disintegrating. They're not aimed towards this higher being of the rabbit. But you can see this example as both kind of a parasitic being example and an example of headlessness, because the head, the purpose, the logos of the rabbit is gone. It's ended, and it is again a multiplicity which doesn't have a head anymore, which doesn't have a united purpose. But it's also a clear example of the kind of parasitic processes which were continually being talked about in the conversation. So yeah,
that's an interesting distinction. Honestly, I hadn't thought of it from that angle. I'm with you on the fact that there's probably like a confusion in those second two categories, right? The parasitic beings and the headless beings, and but I wasn't necessarily thinking of them in terms of a confusion per se, but rather more of it's a second category where there's a continuum. Right? There's two poles within the second category. But no, I mean, I think the way that Vervaeke and Hall were framing it is really interesting, because they're coming at it from more of a scientific angle, and they're seeing things in terms of of thermodynamic processes and entropic processes, right? And so when the rabbit dies, we've got sort of the regime of entropy which is taking back over. And so that can be kind of seen as, in a way, like a parasitism, upon the autopoiesis of the rabbit, right? That's the term that Hall used, autopoiesis. But it's so in that regard, death is the ultimate parasite, right? Death is the ultimate parasite on any entity or any autopoietic entity which is living in accordance with its logos. But then you've got these structures, like something like the mafia, right? Like they were talking about, where the parasitic process itself develops like an autopoiesis, right? It becomes autopoietic. The way that Vervaeke, I think, defined the term, I have it written here. He said something that's autopoietic seeks out the conditions to produce, promote, and protect its own existence. So there's a point at which a parasitism can become an autopoietic process and kind of achieves a stability of being, in a way, even though we could probably fundamentally regard it as the perversion of some underlying principle.
Yeah,
right?
and so we have continuum between the two, because this autopoiesis of parasitism does lead to its own disintegration, right? So
Right.
like
Right.
there is this autopoiesis, but it can't maintain itself, and it's a disintegration at the same time, you know. So it is kind of a contradiction, because I think, without knowing the word super well, I think that an autopoiesis should involve, you know, the ability to sustain oneself, right?
Right.
Should involve like a kind of self-sustaining, the ability to continue oneself. Like if you're like heading down a pathway of disintegration and destruction, which is what the parasitic by definition is, then I'm not sure, maybe that, like, you know, precludes it from being truly autopoietic in a certain way. I'm not sure.
Well, I'm not sure if autopoiesis in and of itself is sufficient for, you know, a sufficient condition for an entity to have true being, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a property of entities which have true being, but it's not like the sole criterion
Mm.
um, for achieving that designation of true being, right? Autopoiesis is just something that allows like a structure or an entity to achieve a certain level of permanence or duration.
Mm.
But maybe the way to look at it is that like these, you can always go back to the Tower of Babel, right? That's the um, sort of mythological or archetypal idea behind these structures which achieve a sort of semi-permanence. The idea is that it's an illusion of permanence, right? It's a semi-permanence which aspires to being eternal, but which falls short, right? And it's destined to crumble.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
and I think that it's a good way of thinking about something which often seems to me to be a contradiction within this area, which is like the identity, or the person, the demonic identity, or the demonic person, or that which has this limited parasitic form of autopoiesis, and the confusion and the disintegration and the lack of identity and the hybridity. So we can see in these examples that, like, you know, there is kind of this contradiction that's held there, but it's not. It's an aporia contradiction rather than one which is really problematic. Like there's this pretense of identity, or this, like, you know, very flawed autopoiesis that masks this chaos, or this hybridity, or this confusion.
yeah, yeah. And for me, where the polarity is in distinguishing, you know, the two subtypes within that category, right? For the subtypes of well, I would characterize the two subtypes as organized autopoiesis, which kind of mimics the divine hierarchy, and then on the other pole we have our headless category, right? Which is where there's an autopoiesis, but it's so loose and fragmented that um, it doesn't even begin to mimic a hierarchical structure, really,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's more like a landscape, a chaotic landscape which is perpetuated in a non-structured way.
Yeah, I was
If that
thinking of
makes any sense.
a different way to, instead of like trying to make the distinction between these two poles more concrete, I was thinking of, like, kind of, you know, bringing those two closer together and combining them, or, like, you know, you could also separate them into poles, but also distinguishing from these two or three categories another uh, another thing which I tried to bring up with Jonathan, which is just the kind of material structure itself, or
Mm-hmm.
the crystallization itself. So this would be just the program of Twitter, and the structures, the algorithms, the objective like stuff of the frameworks of social networks, for instance, architecture, the the physical structure of cities, buildings, etc. Yeah, so like that, I think that that has a certain significance because these structures, um, they contribute towards the way that our attention is like unfolds itself in these entities. But I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure whether it is a good thing to do to like add that in. My mind's not like fully made up on it yet, but it was a possibility that occurred to me.
Well, that's, I mean, it's one of the focal points of our articles
Yeah,
that
because
I
I
feel
don't.
like we weren't able to get to stick, right? We keep on trying to like make that point, and behind the scenes and the conversations that you and I have had with other members of the community, and with Pageau, and even in the Vervaeke Hall conversation, it it might just be that we're kind of off base with the way that we were framing it, because that the distinction that we kept on trying to make between being and body uh, isn't something that really seems to be latching on with other people. Like for me, I still think that I really do think that there is a fundamental distinction to make between um, the way that a living creature is is embodying an eternal principle or a heavenly being, and the way that a man-made structure is doing the same thing. I don't think that they are directly equivalent. Um, there's
Yeah.
something, and I always go back to the to Genesis, where it's the beings that were explicitly created in the 6 days work, um, were animated by the breath of God, right? Like there's a specific point made in that mythological structure, um, of saying that these forms are in a way sanctioned by the, obviously they're more than just sanctioned, they're created by and sanctioned and deemed good by the creator,
Mm-hmm.
right? Whereas a structure, a man-made structure that we can kind of bring into being through like an analogous process, is not automatically or like de facto sanctioned, right? It doesn't necessarily correspond to a divine plan that's like explicitly laid out anywhere, at least scripturally, right?
Yeah.
So, and I
Yeah. I
think
mean
that
that.
the incarnational language that I think is becoming more and more popular in this conversation around higher beings wants to have a seamless analogy there between the way that creatures are embodied and the way that higher beings or principles are embodied through physical structures. And I just think that I really do think there's a fundamental difference. And I think we can put a pin in this if you want and come back to it for later. But I think that it has something to do with the language in Genesis around things being created according to their kind.
Mm.
And so the question, and we can save this for later, but the question is like, what's the kind that we are creating these structures in accordance with?
Mm.
You know what I mean? Um, anyway,
Yeah.
I've gone in like a million different directions with that, so
So
maybe
do
we
you?
rein it
But
back in.
But like you have been thinking about that a fair amount, and you've also like thought about the three categories which we were talking about earlier, and in your discourse on the third category, which you just made before I talked, you mentioned structure in that. So have you that was the path that you were going down, right? You were trying to equate what you've just described in terms of structure with this third category of confused entities.
Ah, yeah, good point. Good point. I was
Or was it an implicit kind of assumption that you had that
no,
wasn't
no,
fully
no. I fleshed it out pretty well in my mind, but we're so far removed from the original conversation that I'm not sure if I even agree with myself or can
mhm.
completely connect back to that original intuition. But um, yeah. it okay. Let me see if I can put it in a slightly different way. There's we were trying to make the distinction between the structure and the beings which bring the structure into being.
Mhm.
Right there is Pageau likes to point to a structure like, I don't know, a city, right, and say that the city is a higher being, and that's always just struck me as a little bit off somehow.
Yeah.
It's to me, it's like this. There's the structure, and then there are the animating principles behind the structure, and it's not as if those higher beings are like literally coming down and like inhabiting the structure.
Mhm.
Uh, it's been that
But
the opposing
the
viewpoint has been argued to me convincingly, like, over the course of the past few weeks, and so I can see where other people are coming from when they say that, like, no, it actually is the case that higher beings are embodying these structures, but the
But I think that, like, so one way of clarifying it might be to say, by structure, do you mean the hierarchy of humans in the city? Is that what you mean by structure?
oh, so for by structure I would mean like an amalgamation of all of the physical components.
Hmm.
Um, and it might even be non-physical components in a way. I mean, because we've got software and programs and scripts that are running, right?
I think that what Pageau means when he talks about um, the body of a city in this sense is the human hierarchy. I don't think he means the physical. I don't think he means the physical
Hmm.
elements. I think he means the humans that comprise the hierarchical structure of the city. Yeah, it's a difficult one.
Interesting.
I think that it's quite. This is why I wanted to make this distinction, because you can have structures, hierarchical structures, which are composed of beings, and you can have material structures. And I think that both categories or both things are becoming involved in this conversation.
Hmm.
And I don't think we've properly separated them or identified the two. And I didn't do that myself in our essays, because I found myself wanting to use the word structure again and again, but then later, now that I see that maybe there might be this distinction to be made.
It is an interesting distinction, but I think that I still do think the two go hand in hand. It's an amalgamation. It's got to be the hierarchical human assembly, in addition to the physical structures which are erected around that hierarchy. And you see that, I think, typologically in the image of the church and the New Jerusalem, right? Like the church, the mystical church, right, in the sort of broader sense, is simultaneously the collection of human beings that are participating in it and the structures that they're inhabiting, right? The structures that they're building to contain uh, that hierarchy. And that's so it's the idea of the the garments of skin becoming glorified, like right, like in the final image. And so I don't think that I think that it's kind of it's a package deal, even though Pageau always makes the analogy of the human body, right, with the cells in the human body comprising the totality of the physical human being. uh, those are living entities, right? And then there's also the matter which those living entities are kind of amassing around themselves in the manifestation of the unified larger human being, right? So it's always like there are like individual beings, individual embodied beings which are participating in the structure, and then there's kind of uh, unensouled matter, which is also participating in in that structural assembly as well.
Like, so an example which might pose a problem to that is, so we have these structures of social media, for instance, but then using and riding those structures of social media, you have different human hierarchical structures and social groups and like human hierarchies, and they're just really different to each other. So you have, and the extreme example obviously is this one, the community underneath Jonathan Pageau. So like that hierarchy, that human structure is like it aims to be one which is illustrating and manifesting true being, which is directed towards God, right? But it's and I think that it does achieve that to a great extent. But it's still using the same social media structures which everybody else is using, right? It's using them in and it's using them often in the same way. Maybe you could say it is using them in a different way, and if you wanted to get in detail, and if you wanted to get really in detail, then it is using it in a different way.
It's redirecting them upward, right? Or at least attempting to.
Yeah. So like if that difference between our community and a different community is a real difference, then surely you must be able to divorce the structure from the community, because it's like an independent variable, right?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure how to respond to that, to be honest.
I mean, it's not. Yeah, we don't need to resolve the questions fully now. I guess one thing which we should think about is like whether we should like do another bit of writing, because I guess I had kind of forgotten the stress that we put on the body, and you're right, they didn't mention it at all in the conversation. And like the conversation was between Hall and Vervaeke and Pageau, to be clear, was really great, and I was really pleased with it. It went way beyond my expectations, but there were some issues with it. Like, I guess they, as you say, they didn't really mention the framework of the body and the principle, and also there were the famous mistakes, which we should probably mention now that we've like laid out some groundwork. There were some pretty important mistakes in the conversation, most notably from John Vervaeke, who really misunderstood the idea. He didn't read the article, which I don't blame him for, because he's very busy and he's just been doing some pretty big things recently. But
yeah, I think this is definitely more of like a side interest for him anyway. So
he really misunderstood the idea of egregore, and because of the vagaries of the Canadian accent, mistook the E for an A and regarded it as egregore. But the way that he pronounces egregore is egregore because of the Canadian accent. It's quite it's quite strange. But so he really strongly defined that as like an entirely bottom up entity, which
an aggregation.
Yeah, which wasn't a part of our work at all. Like we did. I mean, obviously we thought of that early on in our pre-essay work, but it really wasn't a part of.
We made plenty of disclaimers, that our position is one that sees emergence and emanation as always simultaneously operating. So there's
there's that mistake, and that really set the tone for a lot of the conversation, or like it directed it had a lot of power over where the conversation went, and it's also had a lot of power over how people have viewed the subject since. Like Paul van der Klee just went with Vervaeke's definition pretty much, even though his video is also useful in certain ways. But so and there were a few other like aspects to the conversation which were fine, like in terms of it as a conversation, but they did kind of like annoy me a little bit when I think about it as a writer, or like somebody who wants the ideas to be much clearer. There was quite a few of them, but
What
I
were
don't know.
some of those pain points for you?
Well, so one big idea was the idea of the hyper agent like trying to take too much reality, trying to control too much of reality, and as a consequence of that attempt, that's when the parasitic processing rhythms start to manifest themselves, and that's when the like hyper agent starts to decay. But that like line of conversation was taken from the example of the rabbit, and the analogy like really doesn't work at all, because the alive rabbit is the hyper agent, and the alive rabbit the alive rabbit's death is not like a result of that at all. It doesn't really have anything to do with it. It's like they were switching the concept of the alive rabbit, which is like, you know, life as it should be, and they were equating that with a kind of stultified bureaucracy or a mafia.
Right. Right. Well, it kind of has something to do with it.
Yeah. But I mean, like, yeah, I mean, it's not like super huge. Like, yeah, there are links between all of these things, and the ways in which the conversation progressed were really good overall. But yeah, it's just little things like that, and you can defend them in lots of different ways. But just little things.
Yeah, I mean, like it's the way that they approach these things are definitely like in the spirit of what Vervaeke calls dialogos, right? He likes to just kind of like follow the thread and the through line of the conversation kind of wherever it leads, and it's very they don't really have any idea of where they're going to go, and they're not necessarily attempting to direct the conversation in terms of concrete conclusions. But yeah, I mean, I just when you were talking about the mistaken analogy between hyperagents and the rabbit, it made me think of, well, okay, the rabbit kind of is in a way, the rabbit's death is in a way the result of a hyper-agentic process, or some kind of a process attempting to capture too much of reality. It's the attempt of the human being to capture too much of reality, right? Like if you subscribe to the Orthodox Christian doctrine around the fall, it's mankind that is responsible for the death of all things that are living, right? So
yeah,
it's not the rabbits. It's not some sort of like parasitic like bureaucracy like within the structure of the rabbit itself. It's more like a something having to do with man. But maybe that's not.
I just really like the idea in Tolkien, and I've seen it in some other cultures where, you know, the right way to die is to like give away your life, is to like just kind of decide, know when the time is up, you know. But and that is a kind of a death which is more in line with the divine will, but obviously not. It's not totally. It's not the resurrection, right? But yeah, death still happens. The decay of the body still happens in that case. Have you seen Ring of Fire and Indonesian Odyssey?
No.
Yeah, it's probably the best travel documentary that's ever been made. It's like two like quite educated English guys going around Indonesia with a camera in the early 70s or the mid 70s, and they capture some absolutely amazing footage. And it was 50 years ago, so modernity was only really beginning to enter that area, like the depths of Indonesia. And one of the people that they meet is like a 116-year-old like artist, or 108-year-old artist who was a really influential cultural figure there. And during their like time there, he knew which day he was going to die. He like pinpointed the day which he was going to die, and it was the same day, like in the rhythm of his year on which he would complete all of his great works of art. So he would, as I said, he was an artist, and he would complete his great works of art on a particular day of the year. And like he was like, that is the day which I'm going to die. And then he did like lay down his life on that day. So yeah, it's a little bit of a nice example, but yeah, as we say, it's not the resurrection, so it's not a really solid counterexample. So did you watch the conversation of Brett Weinstein with Matthias Desmet?
I don't think so. Is this a recent one? I've kind of fallen off with Brett Weinstein, to be completely honest, recently. I was kind of tracking him up until things got really crazy with all the COVID stuff. And then I kind of lost interest. He seemed to be kind of digging himself into a hole in a way. Not that I completely disagree with him, but it's just his focus kind of lost me there for a sec. But no, so what was that
so he was speaking to Matthias Desmet, who is the guy who introduced the term mass formation, which you might have heard about around in the last few months. And
mass formation?
Yeah. Have you not heard it?
No, I haven't.
All right. It is really related to our work. And so like his work is underlining the fact that to produce a lot of the desired effects that the leaders of modern societies want in order to manipulate society in the way that they want, they need the people to be formed into a mass. So it's the formation of a mass formation, which I didn't understand it as that when I first heard it, but that's what it means. So it's really related to what we to our work, but yeah, it's I guess if you haven't seen it, then
no, I mean, I think that's what you've just described is enough for us to kind of run with for a sec. I mean, yeah, what's I think inevitably going to happen as globalization ramps up is that you're going to see the erection of larger and larger mass structures, for sure. Right. And there's going to be, but because of the rate of change and the rate of technological evolution and expansion, like those structures come into being and crumble like in an instant. Right. So it's this really chaotic, amorphous landscape of these large scale mass structures attempting to crystallize and never quite settling in. Right.
Yeah,
until eventually, like, it does settle in. And it does begin to crystallize, and that's I think, you see a premonition of that in the notion of Antichrist. Like, I don't like to get too much into talking about the Antichrist because I feel like it's just like it's not a good area of focus, and it can lead you into it can lead you to a bad place. But that's kind of what it makes me think of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so many aspects to his theory which fit really well. Like, I think it's a really simple theory that he's come up with, but it is really, really useful. Like, so one of the central features of these mass formations is that he identifies is that they're self-destructive. They work to destroy themselves. quite predictably.
And this is Weinstein's definition, or
No, it's Matthias
okay,
Desmat's.
okay.
Because of Weinstein's focus on evolution, he tries to contradict Desmat and suggests that the mass formation is following the path of evolution, is like, is, i.e., ultimately is not self-destructive. And they kind of end up agreeing to disagree on that one. But yeah, it's
So he thinks it's like a selective process.
yeah, just like ultimately it's for the benefit of the mass in whatever way. He uses so they talk about Nazi Germany. So Nazi Germany is a classic mass formation. Yeah, there's lots of like difficulties with the theory, but which I haven't really like fully worked out yet. But like it's hard to really apply it to modern societies because modern societies are so polarized. Like you have at least two masses, right? And that doesn't really fit because there's only meant to be one mass. And I think that distinctions like that are quite important. But yeah, so like Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union are the classic mass formations. So they're formed through propaganda, and they're formed. They require certain conditions, which for Desmet are like a lack of social bonds and human connection, a lack of meaning in work and everyday life, widespread free-floating anxiety, widespread free-floating aggression, and like those conditions allow the mass to be formed through propaganda, which is so this is interesting for what we were just saying. So the mass is formed by kind of the higher beings of the government, by the higher entities of the government.
He's saying that is the theory that these things will become more and more prevalent as time goes on, or what does the theory say exactly? Or the theory is just like a kind of defining of the term of mass formation?
Well, he's only just released the book, like literally last month.
Oh, okay.
So like the discourse was about, and people were using the word because of Malone going on Joe Rogan, because he used mass formation psychosis. Yeah. And so yeah, I haven't read his book. Unfortunately, I haven't had time yet. But
the question that it leads or that it brings up for me is, where do these masses come from? You know, if we're thinking of things as bottom up and top down, what are they ontologically rooted in, right?
He definitely says that they're created by quite sinister, like higher agents in humankind, like the Nazi Party, for instance.
Right.
The Nazi Party or the Politburo creates the mass or forms the mass, or maybe the ideology. But
if these things are parasitic processes, like what are they parasitic on? I guess.
Yeah, I think that they're parasitic on the pre-existing nation, I suppose. But the nation is a different entity, and that's something that's really important that we need to figure out. I feel like the nation is an entity which has its own definition, which is quite special, which we haven't quite identified yet. And it's a really difficult one, and it's a really interesting one. And maybe it has to do with, I think it has to do with generation, and the natural generation of new life, i.e., the descendants of Abraham, for instance, the descendants of the founder of the nation. But the identity is not that. It's not the person. It's not the founder. It's the ongoing generation, perhaps. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But yeah,
and apologies if you can hear the lawnmowers behind me. If we have to cut this short,
no, it's really faint.
That we can, but okay, good.
It's really faint. Yeah, I can hear them, but it's super faint. But yeah, basically, this is a really big problem in his work, actually. Oh well, I don't know, but I think it's a problem because I've read like a short book which is trying to sum up his theory. Like a guy wrote a short book about his theory because his book hadn't been released yet. And he did it in a really good way. Like he gave like full credit to Matthias Desmat and stuff. But yeah, the sources in this book are really referencing Hannah Arendt. she wrote a book about how totalitarianism in the 20th century was formed, like a really solid background book on totalitarianism. But the way that she wrote about how totalitarianism was formed was really suggesting that the mass was pre-existent and that the
Right.
mass was like a pre-existent entity which was just kind of taken advantage of or like guided by the 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 principals or the leaders or whatever.
Yeah, well, according to our framework, it kind of has to be a pre-existent entity of some sort, right? Like that's the difficulty, or one of the big conceptual difficulties I think in conceptualizing higher beings around larger social structures, right? Like what like it goes back to that um, question that Bernardo Kastrup was asking in his talk with Pageau about, well, what exactly like is a nation, right? If every nation has a sort of guardian angel, what happens when that nation disappears, right, and sort of fades into the dustbin of history? It like
Mm.
does where does that angel go? You know, is there some sort of unique principle, pre-existent principle that's kind of existing in eternity that's sort of the telos that's pulling all of these mass formations into being, right? Um, it's a good question, and I think Pageau's answer is usually something like, "Don't think too much about that." You know,
Mm.
like it's he often says something like the boundaries that delineate entities from each other are fuzzy or hazy, right? And
Yeah,
trying to delineate them super explicitly and analytically is like the wrong way to approach it. Um, so
I
maybe that's
think that.
true. Maybe we're not meant to understand it. I don't know, but
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, it's tough. So the clean one of the clean questions which arose from Pageau and Hall and Vervaeke's conversation was Vervaeke's, which really wasn't answered by anybody, was Vervaeke's challenge of like how we enter into a proper relationship with these higher entities. Um, and I guess we kind of know Jonathan Pageau's answer. We can, which is that if the higher entity is of the first category, i.e., is existing in a direct relationship to God, if it exists in higher love, exists in higher being, then you interact with it by like giving it attention, giving it worship, um, like participating with it. Whereas if it is of the latter two entities, then i.e. the parasitic or the confused, then it's much more ambiguous from Jonathan Pageau's perspective. Um, I mean, yeah, if we include social networks in the latter category, then you know we're all interacting with them. So the option of cutting yourself off doesn't seem to be a solution. So it is apart from if the being is of the first category, then it is quite a difficult question. It seems.
yeah, ultimately it's got to be an issue of gathering in the margin, you know, and turning the garments of skin into robes of glory.
Mm.
I think that's the way to look at it. I mean, and it's a dangerous game. Like it's I think it's hard to know um, the extent to which uh, a person should fully take on and accept certain kinds of technology and certain cultural phenomena, right? as like legitimate parts of one's everyday life. I mean, to a certain extent, you have to participate in some of these things, and I think the way that that Pageau does it is like with always with a mind uh, turned upward, right? Like always like utilizing these tools and technologies and social structures um, in a way that redeems them by kind of redirecting the focus up to the top of the hierarchy. Um,
But then, like, both in the sense of like traditional demonic entities and in a lot of like examples of social media collectives or networks, you there's definitely like toxic or dangerous entities which you just don't interact with, which you just cut
yeah,
yourself off from,
yeah, there
which
are
you just
certainly
like
things you
try
have to
to.
just cut out entirely. Like, and it's I
Yeah.
guess it's hard to know which ones those are.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah, exactly.
it's hard to know. I mean, there's
This
the
this is this is really I think this really reinforces the point that I made earlier, which was unresolved, which is that the distinction between the human structures that are using these technologies and the technologies themselves, or the structures themselves, because like you can see a completely horrific toxic network on social media, and you can just be like, I'm not going to involve myself with that at all, and yet use the same social media platform and just like exile yourself from that community, but be within your own community.
yeah.
um
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's got to be certain structures out there which are just beyond the pale that you have no business really approaching in any way. Um, again, I don't know how you identify those.
so one
I
thing
don't.
that I was thinking about this, which is related to Vervaeke's question, is that the old left, which I was a part of back in the day, the old pre-Occupy left, was extremely good at. Well, it was extremely distrustful of all of technology, but also but not technology itself necessarily. It was more distrustful the of these kind of like weird higher entities, or entities that were using technology for certain ends. So for example, we would be incredibly resistant to and skeptical of advertising, for instance. Um, and yeah, just in so many different ways, people were resistant to technology itself, but especially smartphones. Like, people just didn't have smartphones for years after they were widespread. People like kept to the old brick phones, the first mobile phone varieties. So yeah, I think that that's like an example of a broad like array of practices and principles which were held by a lot of people, which like dictated how they acted towards what we could now characterize as like these higher entities, or the
Yeah,
of the dark the, some of the, and very frequently the darker higher entities.
right. Well, but that's an approach that's primarily one of abstinence, right? And abstinence and avoidance and
Yeah,
mistrust.
yeah, but
And I don't think
that
that you
does have a.
can. I mean, I don't think that you can like adopt that position for long, because those things that you are abstaining from and that you are uh, you know avoiding and mistrusting of, they will eventually overwhelm your attempts to avoid them and go on to define the future. You know what I mean? Like those things that you're trying to push away will eventually come back and sort of completely recharacterize the landscape, and your children and your children's children will have no choice but to face them, in some way. So it's like
Yeah, although the Amish, for instance, are having a lot of success with
that's
their.
true. That's true.
But
Yeah.
yeah, I agree with you. And for us, it didn't. They didn't overwhelm us. We ended up being ineffective because we weren't using them. Like I remember we were part of a protest site in 2014, 2015, 2016, and we thought that we were a really exciting cause, which a lot of like the left in Britain would like to get behind, but we had just no social media presence at all, and the buzz which we kind of intuited kind of should have been there in the if it were the 90s, just wasn't there because, and I think it was because we just didn't have any technological or social media presence.
Yeah, I mean that's the key right there. I think it's the movement wasn't effective because it wasn't utilizing the very thing that it was attempting to avoid. You know, so and I think that goes back to, and I'm not sure entirely about this interpretation, but I've heard it spoken of that you know, there's this idea that after the flood, Noah invents wine, and what that is like a little bit of the flood, like in a cup, right? So it's like carrying forward a little bit of that chaos, of that margin, and using it, kind of keeping it like in view. You know what I mean? Like keeping it like in your field of vision and like under your surveillance and observation. Because if you let go of it, it's going to come back to destroy you, kind of. So you have to kind of stay on top of it, or like one step ahead of it. Learn to kind of to harness it or leverage it in a way.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Taming the dragon, you could say. You know, so
Yeah.
like I fundamentally think that that's the way that Pageau is approaching his relationship to social media. It's like I think he's extremely wary of these things, but I think he realizes that he has to participate to an extent, because if you take your eye off the ball, it's going to come back like to engulf you, basically.
Yeah, but I mean, we were like really behind the game on social media, and I think that's where we failed. But we kind of did exemplify what the analogy that you've just described, because we had a pretty sophisticated tech setup for a place that was off the grid. So we had like solar panels, we had like quite a few solar panels, and like a systems. The trouble with solar panels is you have to have a system that transmits the energy to a battery and then to your devices, and that is that system which is really complicated and quite problematic. Not the solar panels themselves. So we had all of that set up because we had a guy who was good at it. But yeah, so say you have that setup and you're off the grid, you have the cup, right? You have the cup of alcohol, you have the technology, and it's limited. The supply of it is limited because 6 solar panels, 10 solar panels doesn't give you much electricity. It's like and the electricity is linked to a natural process, which is the sun. So like it's I'm not saying that we mastered it at all or like have the solution, but it does. I think that it is an interesting example of like a way that you can moderate practice. Like if your connection to electricity was like really limited, and the times that you could use it were limited, and like it was centered in a community in a certain place. I think that like I've just been watching the series New Girl with my girlfriend. Don't know if you've seen it. Have you seen it?
I haven't seen it, but I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
You haven't seen New Girl. You're
No.
into comedy. You should have seen it.
I know. I'm sure it'll come up.
So the interesting thing about New Girl, it's like a flat in New York, and the conceit of the show, which is just so difficult to believe nowadays, is that the whole flat is like militantly anti-individualistic. Like they So one of the things that they have in the flat is like they have one phone charger in the living room, so that nobody can like retreat to their rooms. They have to like come into the living room to use the single phone charger. So yeah, like I think that little things like that or practices like that could be. It also links in with the whole environmental thing, which is a conversation which, I think it's been kind of dismissed in our kind of corner of the internet. Apart from maybe people like Schmachtenberger and maybe Hall himself.
Yeah, it does. It gets poo-pooed a lot. I think. I definitely think that the environment is a big concern. But
yeah.
you've got figures like David Bentley Hart and John Milbank, who are still, I think, more left leaning in their approach to that issue.
But yeah, so I think like practices like that, like limitations, which are communal, could be quite effective or quite important. Like, and they would have multiple ramifications, like in terms of the environment and in terms of, but more importantly, in terms of our social rhythms and our attention, etc., etc.
Yeah, I think Michael Martin might be a good person to talk to about that. Are you familiar with his work?
Maybe I'm not entirely sure. Probably
He
not.
he's a sociologist and
Oh yeah,
farmer. Yeah, he recently did a talk with Nate Heil and Jonathan Pageau.
Yeah, I saw the talk.
Yeah, and his thing is all about limiting your exposure to technology and going back to more ecological sort of farming practices and self sufficiency, and just kind of like bringing things back down, bringing bringing the higher world like back down to earth in a more embodied way. And that kind of sounds like a little bit of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I really liked his conversation with Pageau and Nate. Yeah, I should be talking to Nate pretty soon.
Oh, really? On what?
Yeah, I'm not sure yet. He just wanted to have a conversation, which should be good. I mean, it'll be on Valentine Tomberg because that's what Nate Heil is all about, and I'm really into.
I hear they're using your readings for
yeah, apparently
for reference.
Yeah, so yeah, that'll be really interesting. They had a great conversation with Pageau, and I was really happy to see that Pageau thought that Tomberg was wonderful in his own words, which was, I guess, like it's really difficult for me to imagine people reacting negatively to Valentine Tomberg, because even though there are some crazy things in there, a couple of crazy things, and I do disagree with him on a few things, just the
egregores included, probably, right?
Yeah. So. But the power of his work and his faith and his like the beauty of a lot of his intention and just a lot. Yeah, it's just a very beautiful, hopeful work.
He's a really, really good example of glorifying the marginal, right? I think if people would have, if there's something to take objection to in Tomberg's work, it's the sort of the aesthetics of it and the connotations and the language that he's using, right? So he's using all of this esoteric and occult language, which Orthodox Christians usually kind of like keep at a very safe distance, but he's showing how you can kind of glorify those things if you take them and redirect them upward in the appropriate way. So maybe he's like the ultimate example of knowing how to use those materials that might lead you into dangerous territory, but as long as you're maintaining a proper hierarchical orientation, you won't be led astray or something like that.
Yeah, he's really like gathering a lot of this kind of fringe stuff and bringing it into Christ. It's and it's theoretically like Christianity should have been able to do that all of this time. Like it has the power to bring things into it and redeem things. And I think that that's what he does with the occult. Like, you know, he identifies where it's gone wrong, but he brings it with him into Christianity. And I think that that's like super powerful. But it does make him like, it means that he can't be like a really central figure. He's like a marginal figure, but he's still within Christianity. But his presence on the margin, I think, is really important. And it was really important for me because I was outside of Christianity. And if you look at it symbolically, if you look at it spatially, in order to come to Christianity, you have to enter through the fringe, right? You have to enter through the outside of it somehow. And if the outside is this kind of clean wall, which is very separated from that which is beyond it, then that makes entering more difficult, I think.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's edifying for me because I can see a lot of the spaces that I've traversed that are maybe not quite so healthy, right? Being sort of reframed and redeemed in his framework, right? Like I see like a lot of I was super into Gnosticism for a while, and I still do think that there's a lot of really valuable stuff to be gleaned from Gnosticism, and I think people just completely throw the baby out with the bathwater with that stuff. But Tomberg shows you how you can incorporate some of those insights, some of the more important ones, like into a completely orthodox framework. So yeah, I see some of those like Valentinian formulas in Meditations on the Tarot, and that really captivated me for a time in my life. And I can see like, oh, okay, here's how you can really frame those up properly, right? Same thing with just Hermeticism in general. I mean, even the tarot. I mean, the name of the book is the tarot is something that most people, most Christians wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole if it weren't for Tomberg. So
yeah, well, this was a great conversation, Ken, and maybe we'll decide to do more writing on this subject, or maybe not. I don't know. Or maybe we'll talk again soon. I'm not sure.
Yeah, we'll see where it takes us.
Yeah, sweet. Yeah, it was great talking to you, man.
You too.